So the comments that I have today have to do with my thoughts around the whole question of sustainability and feminist and post-colonial theory. So I have some reflections to offer in that regard. And I'm glad that not many of my students are here because you've heard this before. So I was looking through Catholic theological materials to see what was the latest, what are the latest reflections in regard to sustainability. And in a little book called Ethics for a Small Planet, New Horizons on Population, Consumption, and Ecology, Dan McGuire, who I admire very, very much, who's a social ethicist teaching at Marquette University, argues that what we need to do in terms of planetary sustainability is to look at what's happening in national contexts. He looks at two national contexts, and I'm only going to look at the one here. He looks at Egypt and China. One of his biggest issues that he points out in this particular essay in this book, it's an essay written by three different people. It's a book written by three different people. In his reflections, one of the things that he points out is that Egypt, once the grain basket of the Mediterranean world, today feeds most of its grain to livestock for a meat diet that's affordable only to a wealthy few. For McGuire, among other things, what's happening at certain levels of national so-called progress or development, we need to see them as parables, as stories possessing a certain lesson for our shared future. He's very, very unagreeing with the ideas that when we think about sustainability, that what we need to point to are simple numbers. So looking at population and making the argument that we need to be sustainable in our practices of agriculture or whatever else it may be, that's not enough. He said, the reason is because we've done this ad nauseam. We know what are the reasons that have led to the kind of decline in our shared quality of life. Among the reflections he offers are ideas that we might have heard before, but bears repeating because I actually want to move to something else that he hints at but doesn't quite develop in this essay. He calls these, there are 6 interrelated social mischiefs that he calls. And he says these underlie the ruination of the earth and its peoples. We've heard this before, this is not new. So the first one that he points to, maldistribution, which is the percolation of privilege to the top. And in the case of Egypt, this is particularly true, he says. Modern capitalism, hand in hand with the kind of social and religious fabric that is in Egypt, still upholds the golden rule of the market, which is the market gets to determine which life is sacred or not. Secondly, the next social mischief is that the national government of almost all of these developing countries is perverted in the service of an elite population. Thirdly, gross iniquities are supported by force and deception. Thus, a military system which is not just domestic but global in its face and character is used to contain the effects of this iniquity. Another hallmark which McGuire points to is male dominance and the suppression of women. As far as he's concerned, there are 2 ways in which this happens. Not only are women systematically excluded from participation in democracies, but they're excluded from those very institutions that might help them become capable of participating in these democracies. So education, for example. Particularly in the case of Egypt or India, if one is to look at that, the rate of female illiteracy is twice that of men in Egypt. McGuire makes a pointed remark here. He says, cultural practices such as veiling or female genital mutilation contribute definitely to the suppression of women, and the Western world displays horror at such cultural practices, but apparently seems to feel no horror at all at Western modes of social and psychological female mutilation. We do it as well in the West. But there is a certain way in which there is disdain or horror actually expressed rightfully at cultural practices in other parts of the world, which indeed do contribute to women and their disempowerment. But there are similar activities going on in our context as well, except it looks slightly different. This leads to indifference with regard to structural issues. In other words, he's pointing to something very important for those of us who are academics or people who are reflecting on these materials or these issues, to think about structural issues that lead to women's disempowerment, women's illiteracy, also indifference on a global level. Interfering in structural systems in other parts of the world leads many first world nations to make the argument that we cannot get involved in the domestic, political, and social contexts of other worlds, including cultural critique. But this kind of indifference ends up having the poor bear the brunt of the kind of practices that lead to general degradation of human life everywhere. And finally, as far as he's concerned, the kind of social devastation we face on the planet is furthered by a lack of family planning and good sex education. The lack of availability of prophylactics, for example, as well. Women who would benefit from fertility regulation are denied these means by poverty, by indifference, or by religious taboos. So he makes a very strong argument. If we are going to make sustainability and justice in a global way a reality for our world, there are two things we have to work with. One, definitely the empowerment of women. The other, a revamping of our cultural and religious symbol systems. Now, I proceeded to read his essay, and I confess I wasn't that impressed with the rest of his essay. So I moved to something, and this is why I said I'm glad many of my students are not here, because you've heard me say this before. I moved to something that I'm far more impressed by in terms of revamping a symbol system. And here I default to my mode of reflection generally. In terms of a post-colonial, feminist, and global ethic, what might we bring to our reflections on sustainability and planetary justice? I would like to read to you a small quote by Gayatri Spivak, in which she has changed the entire topography for ethics as the activity of rational agents or rational subjects to each other. Now the topography of ethics, as far as she's concerned, and this is important because she starts as a cultural critic. For a cultural critic to be drawing on this particular symbol system is a very interesting mind shift. Not anymore are we subjects talking to subjects. This is important because think about it. A third world subject used to be news. As far as Spivak is concerned, there is no more possibility of talking subject because what we are facing is planetary death. In the face of that, what's the point of saying this woman or this third world subject has subjectivity? It's irrelevant anymore. We are facing ecocide. So here's a little quote, I quote, "We have to redefine what it is to be human. To be human is to be intended toward the other. We have provided for ourselves figurations of what we might think is the origin of this animating gift. We have called it mother, nation, God, and nature. These are the names of alterity, some more radical than others. If we imagine ourselves as planetary subjects rather than global agents, planetary creatures rather than global entities, alterity remains underived from us. It contains us as much as it flings away." Now for me, and it goes on, there are a few more sentences here that are very critical. For me, here, Spivak is intuiting something very, very important. Nature cannot be derived from us. It must remain the radical other. We've heard the opposite said. We've heard the opposite said often, that nature is not what is out there, that we are nature. We are it. We are part of it. But the call that she's making to see ourselves as planetary creatures, as obedient, as submitting to the greater alterity of nature, this changes ethics from starting with us and our self-interest to a starting point that is completely not of us. So imagine this, an ethics that places the other, in this case, nature, as the starting point. Not an ethics that starts with us because we may have a missionary zeal, or it is in our self-interest not to kill each other off or to have the planet die, but we start with an ethical frame that has the planet's health as the starting point. So how do we revamp our symbol systems? One of the ways in which she proposes, and this I'm just going to talk about this, is to rethink space and to rethink time. What is space and what is time? We're used to imagining our globe. You know, the very first time that image was taken of the round globe from Apollo 14 or whatever it was, we have this image that this is our home. It is our home, but for Spivak, this home should be defamiliarized. We should make this home an uncanny place. The problem is, with a lot of nature talk, with a lot of our understanding of how the globe exists, we presume a certain familiarity. If we are to imagine the globe as radically different from us, we are able to grant it a meaning, a life, a space, and a time that is underived from us. That's the call. So at the symbolic level, she asks us to imagine this space as an unfamiliar space. Now, how would you make this space unfamiliar? We are so at home, that we think we know what it is. But it is an organic entity that may have a life of its own. So she posits that in order to change our symbol systems, we may have to use art and story in such a way that we interrupt our ordinary modes of thinking and analysis. There's a very interesting story that she translates from a writer called Mahashweta Devi, who is a writer in the Bengali language from Western India. And she translates it, and this has been a little bit of a controversy for Spivak, because Spivak brought it as a story from the so-called third world that interrupts this form of ethics. But what's interesting is Mahashweta Devi, by no stretch of the imagination, is a truly oppressed subject. She's an educated member of an elite class in India. So that in itself created some problems. Of course, she writes in Bengali, so Bengali is not commonly known. Perhaps, that has an interruptive modality to it. Regardless of all the controversy, the story is interesting. The story is called, I'm going to have to refer to the title here. I think the title is Pirtha Puran Shahe and the Pterodactyl. My students would have started giggling here right away because I think the pterodactyl, the pterodactyl is my new icon. How do we make the planet uncanny, unfamiliar? How do we make it a place where we will not be at home? This is important. If we are at home, we imagine ethics as if it's deriving from us. If we are not at home, we imagine ethics as deriving from the other. To make it unfamiliar, to make the space unfamiliar, we have to introduce an unfamiliar time. So story goes this way. It's modern India, Modern India is very, very, very into its nationalist ideology and the fact that it's taking its place on a world stage. You know the story. We have technological advancement, we have medical advancement, we all speak English, not all of us, but some of us, we all speak English really well, la la la. Into this carefully crafted ideology appears a pterodactyl. Now you might ask, something very strange is the story, right? There's nothing real going on. But the story presents you with a conundrum. The pterodactyl, or let's say it this way, a pterodactyl appears to a people who have absolutely no access to modern science, modern images, modern technology. We are used to pterodactyls appearing. Go to any museum of natural history, you will see the bones of a dinosaur, etc., etc. It is recreated through an imaginative act through the medium of science. This pterodactyl appears to an unlettered, illiterate tribal people, tribal being a category used by colonials to describe aboriginals. Tribal people, a real living pterodactyl appears, or so the story goes. The way they know that the pterodactyl appeared is because a 14-year-old boy has drawn the image of a pterodactyl on a rock face. There is no way he could have drawn that image unless he saw one. So they send a government official. This is India, of course. This is how you solve problems, right? You send a government official to ask and interrogate the people as to what the heck was going on. Did someone show you a picture? Did a Western scientist come by and show you a picture? Did you see a TV show? Did you go to a museum? And these are folks who have barely enough to eat. As the story says, they're clinging to life on a cliff face. And the child says, the 14-year-old boy says, no, I never went anywhere. It appeared to me. So the official report comes out. A pterodactyl has appeared in an Indian village. And then, of course, the government of India throws up its hands in despair, saying, we'll become the laughing stock of the international, everybody, all the nations will be laughing at us. It cannot be possible that a pterodactyl appeared. Devi does not solve the problem that you and I have, which is the epistemological one. How can a pterodactyl appear in our time, something that is separated from us by thousands, if not millions of years? But here's the thing. Could there be the appearance of something so alien, so different, so commanding of our attention that we begin to see that planetary time and our time are not the same? That we begin to see that we share this space and time with creatures we imagine is in the past, but could very well be in a living present. The moral of the story is that, is the past past, or is the past present? And if the past is present, what is the future doing? And if that's the case, what kind of ethics might arise from making our space and time so unfamiliar, so strange, that we must say, it cannot but be that a pterodactyl must have appeared. So in other words, I think if those of us, we are in a very interesting place. This is HDS. We are thinking about sustainability as an ethical issue. One of the first things to do is to revamp our symbol systems, that our symbols don't become so available and so familiar to us that we repeat the same way of thinking about the planet. Perhaps what we need to do with Spivak and with Devi is to interrupt those symbol systems and bring a pterodactyl to life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Dan McKanan. He is the Ralph Waldo Emerson Unitarian Universalist Association Senior Lecturer in Divinity. He received his bachelor's degree from Harvard College, a Master of Divinity from Vanderbilt Divinity School, and a PhD from the University of Chicago. He studies religious movements for social transformation in the United States from the abolitionist era to the present. His first book, Identifying the Image of God, Radical Christians and Nonviolent Power in the Antebellum United States, explores theological understandings of violence and nonviolence among abolitionists, pacifists, and temperance activists. His subsequent publications, Touching the World, Christian Communities Transforming Society, and The Catholic Worker After Dorothy, Practicing Works of Mercy in a New Generation, deal with the Camp Hill and Catholic worker networks of intentional communities. Professor McKanan's newest book, Prophetic Encounters, Religion and the American Radical Tradition, is a general history of religion and the left in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Dan McKanan.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's great to see everyone here. Just a quick word about kind of the vision of this panel. As I've seen it, we have done really wonderful work at the Divinity School over the past few years in incorporating practices of sustainability into our daily lives as a community. But some folks in the larger Harvard community have called us to account for perhaps not incorporating these issues as fully in our curriculum and our research agendas as in our shared lives. Certainly they're present in those places as well, but my hope would be that our conversation today will give us a clearer vision for more courses and more research in this community on these important topics. My perspective is as a historian, and I'd like to begin by connecting today's theme to the historical work that I did in Prophetic Encounters, my most recent book, which deals with a wide variety of social change movements in the United States over the course of the past 200 years. Ecological movements play a relatively small part in my narrative there, alongside more extensive treatment of socialist, anti-racist, feminist, and pacifist movements. What I want to talk about today briefly is how the general arguments of that book can apply to sustainability movements in the United States and elsewhere. First of all, in Prophetic Encounters, I argue that religious institutions and ideas are integral to all social change movements, both those that wear their religion on their sleeves and those that are conventionally perceived as secular or anti-religious. So if we want to understand work for social change, we need to understand religion or spirituality as part of the fabric that holds it all together. So for example, one can see the role of religious ideas in Henry David Thoreau's early articulation of an ecological vision, derived out of his conversation with Ralph Waldo Emerson and other transcendentalists, but also out of his partial and, in some ways, incomplete reading of Eastern spiritual traditions. Similarly, the rise of organized environmentalism in a very strong way in the 1960s and 1970s was intertwined with the expansion and transformation of so-called neo-pagan traditions, traditions seeking to make alive in the present previously suppressed strands of ritual observation. Neo-paganism has been intertwined in important ways with the so-called deep ecology movement. Meanwhile, ecumenical Christianity, often at the receiving end of early ecological critiques, provided a very important organizational base for the emergence of notions of environmental racism. Liberal Protestant denominations like the United Church of Christ and ecumenical groups like the National Council of Churches, with a long tradition of relation to civil rights activism, were a bit wary of some of the claims of deep ecology, but very interested in seeing the environmental dimension of the struggles of people of color in the United States and around the world. A second argument of prophetic encounters is that the tensions, as well as the cooperation between religion and social change movements, are inevitable precisely because these traditions are so similar. So any radical social change movement, whether it be socialism or ecology or what have you, asks people to put their daily lives in relation to a more transcendent vision and to gain a new sense of identity through that relationship between daily practice and some broader vision. And that's religious work, whether the transcendent vision is an otherworldly heaven or a future just society. And because of that similarity, some people experience a deep congruence, that honoring embodiment in receiving the Eucharist fits well with honoring the earth by recycling. And other people, seeing the same similarity, conclude they need to make a choice, that mainstream religion is a misleading simulacrum of the real faith, which is that of social and ecological transformation. So a pioneering environmentalist like John Muir is a good example of this tension. He rebelled against the biblical religion of his childhood precisely because he felt he had found a more powerful revelation in experiencing what he called the glory in nature. One recent book that lifts up these kinds of tensions in a particularly illuminating way is Braun Taylor's Dark Green Religion, which is exploring what it means for people to take ecology as their religion. So those are some very general comments. Now I want to share, in the spirit of the questions, what do we know that should be more widely known? One particular piece of knowledge that I have, and that has to do with the way one little-known spiritual tradition called anthroposophy has contributed to sustainability initiatives in the United States and around the world. Anthroposophy is an esoteric tradition founded by the Austrian spiritual teacher Rudolf Steiner at the turn of the 20th century. It's a form of Christian esotericism that broke from the Theosophical Society because Steiner wanted to dig more deeply into spiritual wisdom within Christianity. And another particular emphasis for Steiner was taking esoteric insights and applying them to practical world problems. So he applied them to education and came up with the tradition of Waldorf schools. He applied them to dance and came up with a practice known as eurythmy. And in dialogue with farmers, he came up with this agricultural system called biodynamics. This treats the entire farm as a single organism, using extensive composting to enrich the soil while refusing chemical fertilizers and pesticides. It also includes esoteric practices such as planting and harvesting in alignment with astrological cycles. I first became aware of this when I was a grad student in Chicago in the mid-90s and signed up for a community-supported farm. And sure enough, I was getting a newsletter which had all these very interesting diagrams about the correspondences between the parts of the plant and the parts of the human being and larger spiritual realities. Then when I began teaching in Minnesota, I wanted to do a course on intentional communities, and I encountered Camp Hill, which is a network of rural communities in which persons with and without developmental disabilities share daily life together. Camp Hill became one of the foci of my second book, and I'm kind of returning to it now as I think specifically about what esoteric metaphysical traditions might have to say about social change. Now, one thing I've learned is that anthroposophy in general and biodynamics in particular have a huge impact on sustainability movements if you know to look for it, but yet it's often invisible. So biodynamics actually predates organic agriculture. In the US, it was practiced at the Threefold community in New York and Kimberton Farm in Pennsylvania beginning in the 1920s and 1930s. J.I. Rodale, largely seen as the kind of pioneer of organics in the US, visited one of these farms well before launching the Rodale Institute in the mid-1940s. Similarly, the concept of community-supported agriculture, people buying shares, weekly shares in a sustainable farm, was introduced to the United States by biodynamic farmers in both Massachusetts and New Hampshire in 1985, and has since spread to many places. Biodynamics has influenced sustainability initiatives that might seem to have quite different spiritualities. So one of the great promoters of Gandhian nonviolent practice in the US, Richard Gregg, also spent time on a biodynamic farm. The Catholic worker movement was promoting biodynamics already in the 40s and 50s. And many of the farms featured in Sarah McFarland Taylor's excellent book, Green Sisters, which explores Roman Catholic women's religious orders and sustainability, are doing biodynamic farming. But this is interesting to me because there are significant tensions between anthroposophy and the theological assumptions that I have generally brought to sustainability work. My own ecological commitments grew out of a more general interest in the liberationist strand of Christianity, and especially the work of Sally McFaig, with whom I took a course on ecological theology as a student 20 years ago. Given those influences, a few assumptions that have shaped my views. First, anthropocentrism is a problem and should be repudiated in favor of an ethic of equal regard to all creatures. Second, any plausible theology today should be congruent with the findings of modern science. Third, Platonic dualities of body and spirit are dangerous because they inevitably lead to hierarchies in which the material world is devalued along with women, people of color, and others who are symbolically associated with the lower bodily pairing in that duality. Now, anthroposophy is in tension with all of these assumptions that I bring. As the name suggests, is unabashedly anthropocentric, seeing the human form as the key to a correct understanding of cosmic reality. It is in a good deal of tension with mainstream experimental science insofar as it is committed to an epistemology in which the subjectivity of the knower cannot be bracketed out from the object being studied. So the insights of anthroposophical spiritual science, such as the astrological practices that are part of biodynamics, cannot be validated by ordinary scientific experimentation. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, anthroposophy takes the category of spirit very seriously, more seriously than I'm sometimes comfortable with. For anthroposophists, spirit is ontologically real, not merely a vague metaphor for a sense of the whole. It has effects in the material world without being observable by materialist science. Now, that's not to say that anthroposophy is dualist. It actually has a tripart metaphysical theory in which soul mediates between spirit and body, just as humanity mediates between heaven and earth. But this way of putting it does not, on the face of it, entirely avoid the problem of hierarchy that I had been taught to worry about. So, given these assumptions, I was initially taken aback when I learned about anthroposophy and biodynamics. And I'm still somewhat taken aback. But I cannot help but observe that anthroposophical spirituality has made it easy for many people I know to commit to sustainable practices such as low carbon, low tech, local, community-oriented lifestyles that I and others with this other set of assumptions sometimes find it difficult to embrace. This brings me to my response to the second part of the agenda for this panel. One of the things I want to learn about sustainability in the future is just how traditions like anthroposophy make it easy for their practitioners to embrace sustainable lifestyles. What ought people like me, or like my former teacher Sally McFaig, be learning from traditions like anthroposophy? In what ways, conversely, ought we to stand our ground and challenge certain assumptions of those traditions? Should I encourage my anthroposophical friends to think more deeply about one or more of the assumptions that I identified as my own previously? These questions have both a practical and a theoretical dimension. On the practical side, I'd like to know more about the sort of people who succeed at living in accord with sustainable ideals. Who does the best at recycling, composting, eating locally produced foods, and minimizing use of fossil fuels? If it turns out that anthroposophists are more successful than average, should this be chalked up to their spirituality or to some other factors, such as merely the practice of often living in intentional community? On the more theoretical side, I wonder, do we love the physical earth best by according it supreme value or simply its proper value in relation to soul and spirit? Do we love non-human nature best by treating it as equal to humanity or by correctly understanding its differences? Are we most likely to prevent global warming by standing up for climate science in its battle against fundamentalism, or by challenging the objectivist bias built into experimental science itself? These sorts of questions might fit within a larger, overarching query for further research in religion and sustainability. What religious institutions and spiritual disciplines are needed to help people live joyfully into sustainable, post-fossil fuel lifestyles? How can we achieve ecological justice through joyful choice-making, as opposed to either coercion or self-sacrifice? I emphasize this notion of joyful choice-making in contrast to the two great 20th century traditions of radical social change, Marxism and Gandhianism. Both of these traditions included elements that you could think of as joyful choice-making in the sense that participants in Gandhian satyagraha or Marxist revolution gained a deeper sense of their own agency, their own capacity to change the world, and that usually makes people feel good. But in both theory and practice, the Marxist accent, I think, has been on coercion, and the Gandhian accent on self-sacrifice. Now, both coercion and self-sacrifice have achieved very important changes in struggles against overt forms of oppression and exploitation around the world. They worked well to end colonialism in India, Africa, and Latin America, and in the struggles against South African apartheid and North American segregation. I'm not sure they work as well in an era of mass consumerism, when it is so easy for the power structure to co-opt the masses of the oppressed. Voluntary self-sacrifice might appeal when the alternative is involuntary starvation. When the alternative is the shallow pleasures of television and Walmart, it may not. And yet, of course, from the perspective of sustainability, consumerism is itself the problem that needs to be overcome. I doubt we will free ourselves from consumerism unless we truly see the alternative as more joyful, more abundant, more deeply connected to both spiritual and material realities. Put somewhat differently, consumerism is a form of addiction that feeds structures of oppression. As a form of addiction, it is a disease of the will that causes us continually to make choices that do not, in fact, enrich our lives. I'm inclined to believe that the antidote to addiction is a deeper awareness of other choices that are truly enriching. It may be the pleasure of a perfectly ripened, locally grown tomato, the pleasure of sowing a field in cooperation with one's friends, the pleasure of feeling one's own muscular power in turning the wheels of a bicycle. Any spiritual tradition that opens us up to pleasures of this sort has a vital role to play in building a sustainable world. And so our challenge is to find ways to keep our eyes open for traditions like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Our third panelist, Diane Moore, is the Senior Lecturer in Religious Studies and Education and a Senior Fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions. She received her Master of Divinity here at the Divinity School and earned a Doctor of Ministry at Episcopal Divinity School over on the other side of Cambridge Common, and as well as a PhD from Union Theological Seminary. Her research interests lie in the public understanding of religion through education from a cultural studies lens. Her current focus is on the intersections of religion, ecology, and human rights. She is also interested in the relationship among religion, the arts, and social change. She is the director of the Religious Literacy Project, pardon me, and serves on the editorial boards of the journals Religion and Education and the British Journal of Religious Education. She is also chair of the American Academy of Religion's Task Force on Religion in the Schools, which conducted a 3-year initiative to establish guidelines for teaching about religion in K-12 public schools. She was also the director of the Program in Religious Studies and Education here at HDS. Her book, Overcoming Religious Illiteracy, A Cultural Studies Approach to the Study of Religion in Secondary Education, was published in 2007. She was one of 2 professors chosen by Harvard Divinity School students as the 2005-2006 HDS Outstanding Teacher of the Year. She also teaches at Phillips Andover Academy in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, and she is an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Please welcome Diane Moore.
Thank you, Eric. It's my pleasure to be here. I always learn a lot from my colleagues, and I have a great title for a new course: Pterodactyl Ethics and the Sustainability of Joyful Choices. I like it. I'm going to focus my comments on my role primarily as an educator and to take on the questions you asked us to consider regarding the kind of challenges we face around understanding better the relationship between religion and sustainability, and then some potential choices we can make as religious studies scholars. And I'm going to use as a kind of case study, if you will, a 1967 essay by Lynn White, which is quite well known. You might call it famous, you might call it infamous essay. And in that essay, he's a Christian theologian, and the essay is entitled The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And many of you, I think, are probably familiar with this, but let me just read an excerpt from it and then talk about using this as a case study in a sense to talk about how this essay was received as an example of what I think is problematic about the nature of how we deal with religion and anything but religion and sustainability. So this is, again, an excerpt from Lynn White's 1967 essay. I personally doubt that disastrous ecological backlash can be avoided simply by applying to our problems more science and more technology. Our science and technology have grown out of Christian attitudes towards man's relation to nature, which are almost universally held, not only by Christians and neo-Christians, but also by those who fondly regard themselves as post-Christians. Despite Copernicus, all the cosmos rotates around our little globe. Despite Darwin, we are not in our hearts part of the natural process. We are superior to nature, contemptuous of it, willing to use it for our slightest whim. Ronald Reagan, the newly elected governor of California, 1967, remember? Like myself, a churchman, but less troubled than I, spoke for the Christian tradition when he said, as is alleged, quote, "When you've seen one redwood tree, you've seen them all," end quote. To a Christian, a tree can be no more than a physical fact. The whole concept of the sacred grove is alien to Christianity and to the ethos of the West. For nearly 2 millennia, Christian missionaries have been chopping down sacred groves, which are idolatrous because they assume spirit in nature. What we do about ecology depends on our ideas of the man-nature relationship. More science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. Again, that's Lynn White. Now, the response to that was remarkable. He caused quite a stir by that essay, and there were two strands of response that really were then treads, if you will, that continually are reproduced today. The one strand is what Wendell Berry calls the self-evident truth now, thanks to Lynn White or people like him, that everyone says now that it's just common knowledge that the root cause of our ecological crisis is Christianity, or more widely than monotheism, this notion of domination of nature, and that's a well-known and widely assumed fact. And the second for Wendell Berry is this well-known and widely assumed fact that as a result, Christians particularly, and then other monotheists, can't really contribute in any meaningful way to the ecological crisis we face because of that assumption, that set of assumptions. So Wendell Berry, as you can imagine, is quite frustrated with that self-evident set of normative assumptions as a result of Lynn White's essay. But that's one strand of response, that he's right, and that it exposes the truth in the naivete of Christianity or the problematic foundations of Christianity, and therefore we can essentially dismiss Christianity and all of monotheism as any meaningful resource for us. So that's one strand of response to White's essay. The second strand is, of course, from Christians who are saying, oh, no, no, no. We actually don't only think that. We have great things to say and great contributions to make about the ecological crisis, and that's particularly one strand, but even how we understand or interpret that notion of domination is itself something that is worthy of our consideration, and it's not really domination, it's more stewardship, and a whole host of then assumptions, apologetic assumptions about the nature of Christianity. That's another strand of response. Now, both of those have some truth in them, but from my perspective as an educator, they're both really fundamentally flawed and in self a part of our problem, in the sense that we need better and more sophisticated understanding of religion itself in the public square to help us understand that religion's not either one of those things, Christianity's not either one of those things, that in fact it's a really rich and complex ideological dimension that religions hold throughout all dimensions of our cultural, historic, and political life. Religion is everywhere. You cannot embrace or separate the notion of religion from any of our cultural, historical, political assumptions. Yet we constantly, in our contemporary age especially, make the assumption that religion resides in an isolated dimension of our lives, the kind of private dimension of ritual, the private dimension of belief, which is itself, of course, profoundly a Protestant Christian assumption, which is itself an embedded notion within our cultural assumption of the powerful role that religion plays. So from my work and my concern, to tackle the question of better understanding of the resources that religion can and do and should supply to understanding sustainability, we have to have a better, more sophisticated understanding of religion itself. And there are three dimensions of that assumption that are pretty well known for those of us in religious studies, but sadly and strikingly and profoundly unknown to those outside of religion. That first of all, religious traditions and expressions are internally diverse, profoundly internally diverse, complicated and internally diverse. Second, that religious traditions and expressions that we call religion evolve and change and are culturally embedded and culturally distinctive. And there's not a singular or static or notion of religion that we can hold up as time impervious to time and change. And then third, and probably again the most important, that I think this notion of the way that Lynn's essay I think is important but overstates the case, that religions are deeply embedded in all dimensions of our cultural experience. And that's the third assumption that is probably the most relevant for us here, in the sense that if we understand and ask the religion question, religion, I contend, is like race, like ethnicity, like all other dimensions of our human expression and experience, and in some context, our identity. In the sense that we used to be able to have courses, and unfortunately still do in some places, where we would say we would have a course in introduction to American history, and we'd have 14 or 15 chapters of a textbook about American history, and then we'd have the 16th chapter would be women in American history. Or that 17th chapter might be African Americans in American history. So this notion somehow that those people were not in any way related to those earlier 15, 16, 17 chapters. We do that with religion. We still do that with religion, as though religion now only shows up in American history, for example, when we speak about the Puritans or the Awakenings. Maybe we'll bring it in if we get it far enough along in the rise of the Christian right in the 1980s. But we don't understand to ask the religion question. If we ask the religion question, like if we ask the gender question, the sexuality question, the socioeconomic class question, it's always there. It may be explicit, it may be implicit, but the ideological power of religious expression is deeply embedded in all dimensions, sometimes, again, more explicit than others. So first of all, we have to get a better understanding of that. And then we have to challenge the notion that religion is a positive or a negative force, which is the other problematic representation of the response to Lynn White's essay, as though religion is a positive or a negative. It's neither, it's both, it's all. And to understand the relationship between religion and sustainability, I think, is to really recognize the importance that religion's always there in any conversation about ecology and sustainability. Is it a positive dimension, cultural dimension? Is it a negative one? What are the roles that religion plays in shaping the way that a given conversation or understanding about the political or ethical questions that we engage with sustainability? What role does religion play in that? Uncovering that power and then being able to critically reflect on its impact is a really, really important dimension of our capacity to understand the resources that religion can play in helping us more deeply understand the challenges we face. So this question for me is really about education and larger questions around religion, and then the sophisticated understanding about religion's role in this particular context as almost a case study, if you will. And then finally, I just want to end with saying that not only do we need to better understand the role that religion plays, like Lynn White, and I think, again, he way overstates the case, but he's really right in understanding that the notion of domination is so deeply normative for so much of Western culture, and that is supported by a particular theological strand of Christianity. It's not exclusive to that, it's not the only interpretation, but it became a normative set of assumptions that then, again, is something that we need to at least uncover and interrogate to recognize that, first of all, there's choices around that. It's not inevitable. There's a cultural bias to that. There's a cultural and dimension of why that particular theological expression became prominent and then embedded so deeply. So there's a question of power and influence in that set of questions. So we need to understand that better, to understand what are the assumptions that are so deeply embedded as normative in our cultural context that we take them to be matter of fact. We take them for granted. We have to better understand that language. We have to ask different kinds of questions. So religion will play an important role in that, both in a positive, those of us who are concerned around questions of sustainability, religion can play and has played positive roles in regard to those questions, as well as deeply problematic ones to continue to give credibility to the kind of questions of domination and abuse that are so troubling to us. But the other is that religion, again, also becomes resources in this larger question of sustainability around what does it mean to tackle an overwhelming challenge that when we look at the ecological crisis, and I work with secondary students who get numb and paralyzed, and they're not alone, around the challenges that these crises raise for us. What does it mean to be able to tackle something that is that enormous, have hope about the power and the process of tackling it, the worthiness of taking on this challenge, and a capacity for sustainability over the long haul? And that itself is countercultural in a community that promotes the notion of clear and quick return to our focus, if you will. A sense of our efforts need to show fruits, clear fruits of meaningfulness and of effectiveness. Otherwise, we lose interest pretty quickly. And so what does it mean to have just shift a paradigm itself of what it means to commit to a process rather than a goal or a destination? And that, again, religion is not uniformly going to help us with that, but it gives us language and experience that we can utilize to think in different kinds of ways. And then finally, one final comment, and there are some of my students in the room, and you have heard me repeat this over and over again. I feel like one of the most profound challenges we need to be facing now is the normativity of neoliberalism. And the neoliberal paradigm that is so now deeply embedded, and this is 20 years in the making, but now is so second nature. The frameworks around the nature of how we measure success, the way we even think about measurement itself, the deeply embedded market economic values that are represented in the neoliberal frameworks, the fact that now political and economic categories are collapsed within neoliberalism. Religion helps us with uncovering that normativity and potentially providing. There are religions that support neoliberal frameworks deeply, theological expressions that are deeply supportive of that framework, but there are others that challenge it. So yet again, the foundation that Dan and Susan both represented around the kind of consequences of some of those neoliberal frameworks. I think a better understanding of religion can itself help us at least recognize and uncover those frameworks and potentially provide a challenge to them. So again, ultimately for us, I think it's really critical for us to have a more sophisticated understanding of religion that we will ourselves take on, be explicit about, invite our colleagues in other disciplines to have to take seriously, do collaborative work with colleagues in other disciplines rather than feel like we can live in an island on our own. We can't afford to do that any longer because when others reproduce and represent religion for us, which they do regularly, we are all the worse off for that representation. We need a better, more sophisticated understanding. It's our role as religious studies scholars to offer that, and I hope that many of us will continue to do that in a lot of different arenas, but certainly in this really critical arena of sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. And just before I introduce Tim, he will need this back screen here. So if you wouldn't mind moving to these reserved seats, you'll preserve your eyesight for a little while longer. Our final panelist, Tim Weiskel, graduated magna cum laude from Yale University. He trained as a social anthropologist and historian, as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. Apologies for my horrible French. Following field work in West Africa, he received his DPhil from Oxford University and returned to the United States to teach anthropology and history at Williams College in Yale, and currently teaches at Harvard's Extension School. His research concentrates upon belief systems within cultures and how core cultural beliefs can either facilitate or block change over time. In particular, he has examined how dominant belief systems serve to impede or enable different cultures to perceive the changing environmental challenges that confront us all as a human family. He has also helped to found the Cambridge Climate Research Associates, which consults with organizations to create on-site and online training programs for institutions, universities, corporations, municipalities, and national governments. The goal is to assist these organizations in analyzing the climate impact of global carbon consumption and help them envision the necessary transformations we must all now undertake to enable the human community to move to a post-carbon fueled world. Please join me in welcoming Tim Weiskel.
Well, one of the advantages of coming last is that everything good has been said. And all I have to do is underscore it in a sense. And I'll do it if I can get this thing operating with a few illustrations. It should be said that I'm a techno-peasant, and that's giving peasantry a bad name. This is the old dog, new tricks category. I'm not really that good at it, and I'm learning from my students each year. But we shouldn't, in a sense, blame them for my inadequacies. They can all, as can my nephews and nieces, instruct me, and usually do on each occasion, family gathering and the like. And I gather most of this stuff is being tweeted nowadays and has various other kinds of vocabulary associated with it. I don't like to tweet. I don't like the limit of whatever it is, like 147 words or something like that, or characters. And it'll be interesting to see if I can get any of it to work. But if I can, I want to underscore a couple things, and until it comes up, we'll see. First, thanks to the Divinity School for holding this, which I don't think is widely discussed around the campus in general. So you guys are in the forefront in some respects, but also you've been in the forefront for a long time, and that's the thanks I want to extend as well. I came here 25 years ago on a fellowship to the Divinity School from the Luce Foundation to study environmental ethics. Now, there's been a bit of a hiatus, and I suppose one of the things to do would be to explain what happened in the intervening 25 years, but that would be too boring for words and probably not very instructive on where we need to go from here. So I won't indulge in that, except by way of thanking a few key individuals, and people like Roy know they should be included from the outset, for having kept alive, in a sense, the tradition of what we're discussing today, even during a period of relative lapse. What I wanted to emphasize, though, too, was that I came to the Divinity School with, in effect, a very different sense of what religion was about. I was trained as an anthropologist and historian, and we approach religions in a very different way than divines do, as I found out very quickly in the first few months of being here. We look at what religions are. That is to say, religions are what religions do, and people's religions are what they believe in religiously. What they believe in is what they do on automatic. Your beliefs are not what you think. Those are thoughts. Your beliefs are what you do when you don't know what you're doing. What guides your behavior when you don't know what you're doing is what you believe in. If you believe in it religiously, it's a religious belief. How do you know whether you believe in it religiously? Very simply, a religious belief is that kind of belief that you're more willing to defend than examine. So it's a question of habits, culturally learned, which you will defend. That is the realm of religion. For that reason, I'm going to argue very briefly here today that religion is our last best chance for sustainability. It's also our biggest remaining obstacle, because our habits of thought, mind and heart, have to change radically from what they've been in the past in a very short period of time. Now, this is what I actually teach, and you can probably get access to it on the web, since I teach all my courses now on the web, and you can see what's involved. We do this through the Extension School, and when you get connected on the web, you can get some of this stuff pretty interestingly, in a way. It's all made available now through everything, like YouTube, which comes up every once in a while with interesting material. What I argue is that because we now realize that we are alive with millions of other species on the only blue, life-supporting planet in the known universe, we are in need of a new human ethic of sustainability. We must now learn, as cosmic citizens, to embrace the full range of humanity in all its unfamiliar forms, struggle together toward a common goal of global sustainability, and cherish and celebrate that time that now remains for the human moment in Earth's self-renewing an ever-changing web of life. I tell my students early on that it's your task in this course, this is the course on the ethics of sustainability, and well beyond it, to find your voice, join the chorus, and sing your heart out with all the passion and commitment you can muster. Sing as if your life depended upon it, because in fact, it does. The reasons I came to this insight are not particularly from organized religion. In fact, you'll find that I have some problems with organized religion. I'll go over these a little bit at length in the future, but why don't I get to my conclusions first, since I might not get to them if I ramble on. First, fatal religious beliefs are Abrahamic exceptionalism, whether it's the chosen people or those who feel they're chosen by covenantal confessionalism, or those who feel that, in the words of the tradition of Islam, there's one God and Muhammad is his prophet. All of these three Muhammad-oriented traditions tracing their, in effect, lineage to Abraham, who becomes Abraham, and then either entitles people who are chosen for their confessions or their covenants. I think this is the biggest contemporary crisis we have, underscored by others, especially Diane just recently. This notion of liberal economies is installed and inscribed in us in the belief in growthism, that growth is always and everywhere good. Growth uber alles, as it is often phrased, is the, in effect, justification for... We had a president who was a classmate of mine as a Rhodes Scholar, in fact, who spent his time saying, it's the economy, stupid. Well, Bill, it isn't the economy. The economy is a subset of something else, and if you don't learn how to live in the rules of that something else, your economy is not going to be much good. The latest apostle of this apostasy is Danny Yergin. You can hear him on Wednesday. He'll be teaching in the Science Center at 5 o'clock. He gives a 2-hour lecture as part of the environment program, of all things. The third, and I think most insidious form of religious belief that we're all subscribing to is techno-scientific salvationists. Thanks to science, we'll think of something, or usually they'll think of something, right? Some technological rabbit will be pulled out of some technological hat, and things will be okay. Now, the combination of all three of those things, Abrahamic exceptionalism, we're not like the great unwashed, we're different, right? Growthism, that all we have to do is sort of focus on more, bigger, better logic, and technoscience, thanks to science, we can avoid the problems of constraint in an ecosystem. Those can combine very powerfully together, in effect, to be our biggest religious problem. And the reason for this is that while we may be architects of our own fate, we're not working under conditions of our own choosing. This is just a representation graphically of what happened since the beginning of 1900 to 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, 75 to the present, and guess what? We're just beyond the year 2000 with the convergence of a peaking oil supply, growing population, and planetary temperatures going beyond all expectation, and in fact, usually confounding the measurement systems we've got in place. So there are 4 simple truths we've got to learn very quickly. There are going to be some major historical discontinuities that we will encounter in the near future. Perhaps not in my lifetime, but certainly in the lifetime of most of the students in the room and anybody that would be my nieces, nephews, or children's age. Currently, we're not being told about these discontinuities, not because there's a conspiracy of silence, but because most of those in the charge of educational institutions or political institutions don't realize it. They are equally ignorant about this. Our ignorance, however, will be no excuse. We're going to be whacked by these discontinuities anyway. There will be no escaping these potentially catastrophic discontinuities. Finally, we will need to learn to think clearly and act deliberately in order to survive, not just to do well, but in order to survive. This isn't a question about the economic system or like, but as a species. Now, what's a discontinuity? This is a kind of discontinuity. What obtained during this phase of growth of what this represents population is not obtaining during this. What obtained during this period and its decline in carrying capacity is not obtaining there. There's a discontinuity in three different phases here. One where carrying capacity is widely separated from a species, a specific presence, and then as they two approach each other, they stabilize, but a more probable discontinuity, one that is repeated as a kind of drumbeat in human history. Not the exception, the rule is one of overshoot and collapse, overshoot and collapse, overshoot and collapse. If you doubt this, start rereading your Bible, which is not a book. It's a library of books. It's a library of books about overshoot and collapse. Now, the people who make this clear to us are those from the prophetic tradition, people like William Sloane Coffin at Yale, who very clearly, more than 40 years ago, had a strong injunction.
As I see it, the primary religious task these days is to try to think straight. Seeing clearly is more important even than good behavior. For redemptive action is born of vision. Religious faith, far from being a substitute for thought, makes better thinking possible. You can't think straight with a heart full of fear, for fear seeks safety, not the truth.
Now think about that in reference to what we're thinking publicly. We've got a politics based on fear, but you can't think straight with a heart full of fear, right? Because what we look for is safety, not truth. Now, if you're looking for truth and not safety, you come up with a very different approach to things.
If your heart's a stone, you can't have decent thoughts either about personal relations or about international ones.
Now, this may help us understand a bit about people who've just had heart transplants. We don't know much about their new hearts, but in any case, they can't have decent thoughts about personal or international relations if they are driven by fear.
A heart full of love, on the other hand, has a limbering effect on the mind. And Christians should never think they honor the greater truth they find in Christ by ignoring truths found elsewhere.
Okay, the many thanks I owe to people here start with the towering figures like George Williams, who in effect was the Hollis Professor of Divinity and for a long time drew the attention of the public to the tension between the wilderness and paradise themes within the religious tradition. People like Ted Hebert, who taught here when I was first here 25 years ago and drew attention now in paperback to the Yahwist landscape, rereading that whole tradition, which some people abuse. People like Gordon Kaufman, who in effect reconstructed theology on a whole different basis. If taken seriously, we wouldn't have half the problems we do. And of course, not just famous men, but famous women. Mary Evelyn Tucker put together, 11 volumes, I think it is now. She edited this one on Buddhism, but several of the others with her husband as well, John Grimm. And this was an extraordinary, still stands, is the biggest single collection of reflection on religions and ecology. This was all part of that tradition, as was this Harvard Seminar on Environmental Values. Started years and years ago before the internet. As soon as Al Gore invented the internet, we got on it, as it were. But we did it from the late 80s on, and we put it out in public space where you can get access to all of these old things. One of the things we looked at was air, breath of life, winds of change. And in that process, we began to look at the whole question that Bill McKibben brought to our attention when we brought him here as a fellow for a year in this Center for the Study of Values in Public Life. And it's from him that we learned a lot. But even before he was here, a number of us took this thing rather seriously from the Divinity School. And we went down to Washington, to the Senate, and said, listen, pay attention. Something's happening here. This was in 1988, right? We're dealing with 22 years ago here, and it was recorded by C-SPAN. Take a look at it. I mean, some of us got really heated at the time. Weren't really understood why a theologian, or I wasn't a theologian, I was an anthropologist from a divinity school talking to the Senate, right? Chair of the committee at the time said, you know, I don't think we've ever had an anthropologist talk to the Senate. I said, well, you know, want to take a look at it. They wrote it up in hearings, but I wrote it up as a book because they said, we haven't seen this before. Can you provide us with a little documentation? And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I can. So I wrote the book to do it. It's a huge annotated bibliography for them. To look at what? Well, pattern, trend, and prospect of human intervention in the ecosystem. Now, you have a tradition that can start as of this morning, at least this is when I picked it up in the Gazette. You've got a new dean who can take forward this tradition out. He knows a great deal about missionary presence and the like. So even if on the Harvard campus, questions of sustainability have moved off to the extension school, where we now actually give a degree in it, you can get a master's degree, almost totally online, in sustainability. And, you know, I didn't go through it here, but it's just by way of saying where I work now. And the person who made that possible was Mike McElroy, who stood for years as chairman of the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. What a kind of perspective that is, right? And said, look, when you want to discontinue it at the Divinity School, it's much too important to get rid of from Harvard. We'll keep it over here. And he set it up as a special office within the University Committee on Environment. He then went on to do other things, including looking at the entire transition of China from the oldest structures we know and can see from space to some of the newest technologies we're involved in. He's head of the China project. And now the university committee's in the very capable hands of Dan Schrag and Professor James J. McCarthy, who you can hear again is the Agassiz Professor of Biological Oceanography. Bill Mumaw helped me a lot in learning about these things. Then we, two of us, set up this Climate Talks project, and we've been teaching courses on things ever since: environmental ethics and land management, and introduction to environmental justice, how we should relate to one another. And then this Cambridge Climate Research Associates. But it was Bill, beyond any of the intellectuals, who put it to us. And why? Very simply because, as he said,
the issues I have chosen to discuss are among those which seem crucial to the nation's well-being and to the planet's survival. All are controversial and, for the most part, intensely political. But let no one say that for being more political, an issue is less spiritual. A fine prayer reads, to those who have hunger, give bread. To those who have bread, give a hunger for justice.
Wow. We need to ask and then answer, with all this impressive religious and intellectual support for sustainability, what are the religious obstacles we now face? As I indicated earlier in just listing them, I think there are three major ones, and primary among them is this.
Myth of global warming. That statement alone will provoke 500 letters to the editor by the tree huggers and the liberals and everybody who gets upset at any challenge to the alarmism and the hysteria that's going on because of the claim that man-made global warming will bring an end to spring and summer and fall and winter, and the sea will rise to horrific levels, and the heat will melt Antarctica and the North Pole, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and we will find ourselves in a global tsunami.
Well, you can get access to this off our web pages. You should note that he then, from the Thomas Road Baptist Church, offered free copies of a very interesting document. Basically, a set of speeches made available, still online, on a government website that, in effect, promotes the perspective of Inhofe, who's just recently, last month, published this book on the great hoax that climate change, alarmism represents. Santorum has taken this to new levels. Growthism is our other big problem. You can see this, as I say, on Wednesday at 5 o'clock, but you'll see it on your TVs more recently.
In your book, you debunk the theory of peak oil and argue that the world is not running out of fossil fuels. Why not? What's your theory?
We're not running out of oil anytime soon. Ever since oil started as a commercial industry in western Pennsylvania in 1859, there have been recurrent fears and scares that we're running out of oil and this time it's over. But every time we see new technologies applied, new areas open up, and we've seen that today with the growth in U.S. Domestic oil production.
Okay, no real problem here, no real problem of constraints. The thing he doesn't ask, because he's looking at this narrow period, he calls it a plateau, not a peak. If you look at a longer frame of reference, Jürgen's plateau is right on top of a pretty major peak in the sense that all of Western civilization, as we've come to know it, which has tripled in my lifetime from 1946 to the present, the world's population has tripled. That did not happen in a generation before. It will not happen in the generation next. We cannot triple yet again. And further, Danny forgets something here. Suppose you've got access to carbon. What happens to it when you use it? It doesn't go away. There's no way in an ecosystem. You can oxidize it, but it becomes atmospheric. At that point, you change something really extraordinary. It's a major intellectual form of heresy to proceed as if you can ignore these things now, and he does. And so, as the cartoonist put it, while the end of the world scenario will be rife with unimaginable horrors, we believe that the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunity for profit. This is exactly what he's saying to Obama, and it's what Obama's listening to. The problem is that we're in real trouble because too many people believe this to be the case.
My personal opinion is that we have to keep geoengineering on the table. We have to look at it very carefully because we might get desperate enough to want to use it. The danger, of course, with geoengineering is the one I was referring to a moment ago. We don't understand the system well enough to predict its responses in detail, and that means there's always a danger if you try to engineer the system on a large scale that you will do something that has side effects that are worse than the dimension of the problem you're trying to cure.
Okay, now this man's not insignificant. He's Obama's science advisor. He also holds 2 chairs here, the Heinz Professorship over at the Kennedy School, and he's a professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences, talking to Obama, among other things, about altering the Earth's climate by sending up mirrors, sending up sulfur dioxide to shield us from incoming sun. This is geoengineering on a scale gone mad, right? But there is this fundamental belief, sort of based in the arrogance of humanism, that the Earth is there for us to tinker with, right? We've been given dominion over it. If you combine this techno-scientific arrogance with the sense of chosenness and exceptionalism that comes out of our traditional religious tradition, you can see we're in trouble here. We're in the grips of worldviews derived from the Brahma cultures of the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, in the Palestinian Hill Country. These cultural assumptions need to be re-examined, and we need to move beyond the exceptionalism inherent in anthropocentrism. Why? Because here's where we are, and here's what's happening on a scale we can't really cope with. This is where we're going to have to go. The growth rate is going to have to come down like that to near zero for this to become stable, sustainable. Now, Thomas Berry, a fellow here when we had this going 25 years ago, made this very clear. We have to choose either to go forward with what he called the Technozoic or the Ecozoic. And we're in that choice at this point. We're in the choice because there's no opting out. At this point, we've seen it. And we can now see what its implications are going to be. This is the way scientists map what's happening annually to us. You can follow the calendar, 81, 82, 83. These are the trends. And it's why we need to move on all fronts, because the last best chance we've got is to figure out how to subordinate our understanding of ourselves within a sustainable ecosystem. We're expendable. It's not. Thank you very much.